The hospital doors opened on a quiet afternoon, bringing with them a ghost from the past. Alo stood in the corridor, his mind trying to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. There, in the doorway, stood his sister Chika, the same sister whose death they had mourned years ago, whose empty casket they had buried, whose loss had broken their family apart. The world tilted beneath his feet. His heart stuttered in his chest, and darkness crept at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before collapsing was her face, older, worn by time, but unmistakably his sister's. Alo, brother. Chika's voice cut through the fog as doctors rushed to help. Her voice, a sound he thought he would never hear again. When consciousness returned, Alo found himself lying on a hospital bed, his sister's warm hand holding his. Tears streamed down his face as he reached out to touch her cheek, needing to know she wasn't another dream, another cruel trick of his grieving mind. Is it really you, Chika? His voice trembled. We buried you. We mourned you. Papa died of heartbreak weeks after your funeral. Chika's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand. I had no idea, brother. No idea you thought I was dead. Her voice caught in her throat. I've been alive all this time, but lost to myself. The story she told shattered everything Alo thought he knew. On that fateful day, when news came of the burning bus and unidentifiable bodies, Chika had never boarded. Instead, she had visited a man who promised to heal her son's legs. But his price was too high, his intentions too dark. When I refused him, she whispered, he raised a stick, spoke words I didn't understand. Then darkness took me. For years, I lived in madness, trapped in his shrine. Her hands trembled as she spoke, until I heard my son's cry. Something broke through the spell. I heard a Hannah calling for me, and I found my way back to myself. Alo's heart froze at the mention of a Hannah. How could he tell her? How could he explain what had happened to her beloved son? The weight of those years of cruelty pressed down on him like a physical thing. Where is my son? Chika asked, her eyes scanning the hospital corridor. Where is my Hannah? The silence that followed her question was deafening. Alo's face crumpled with grief and guilt. Sister, he began, his voice breaking, there's something you need to know. Just then, they heard commotion in the hallway. Police officers were escorting a woman in a wheelchair, Elle, now paralyzed and headed for prison. As she passed them, her eyes met Chika's, and recognition dawned on her face, followed by pure terror. How dare you plead for mercy after what you did to my son? Chika's voice rose like thunder in the hospital corridor. I hope you rot in jail forever. The reunion of brother and sister, meant to be a moment of pure joy, was now stained with the darkness of what had happened in those lost years. As Elle was wheeled away to face justice, Chika turned back to her brother, her eyes burning with a mother's need to know the truth. Tell me everything, she demanded. Tell me what happened to my son. And so, in that sterile hospital corridor that smelled of disinfectant and despair, Alla began the painful task of explaining how their family had been torn apart not once, but twice. The story he would tell would break his sister's heart all over again. But this time, she was here to feel it. This time, she was alive to fight back. The truth came out in waves, each revelation more painful than the last. In the quiet hospital room, Chika sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap as Alo told her what had happened in the years she'd been lost to madness. We held a funeral for you, Alo began, his voice soft with old grief. The bus accident. They said the fire burned so hot, no bodies could be identified. Mama cried for months. She would wake up in the night calling your name. He paused, the memories still raw. Papa. He just gave up. Went to sleep one night and never woke up. The village elders said he died of heartbreak. Chika's tears fell silently. She had been alive all this while, trapped in a madman's shrine, while her family shattered with grief. While they lowered an empty casket into the ground, she had been lost in darkness, unable to tell them she was alive. But there was more, always more. Your son, Alo continued, his voice catching. Hannah, he's gone. The word gone hung in the air like poison. Chika's fingers dug into her palms until they left marks. What do you mean gone? Her voice was barely a whisper. Alo told her everything. About taking a Hannah in, about Ifir's cruelty, about the crutches hidden on top of the wardrobe. With each detail, Chica's face grew paler, her body more rigid. When he reached the part about a Hannah being abandoned in the forest, she made a sound like a wounded animal. The police searched, he said, the words coming faster now, as if speed could lessen their impact. They found nothing. No body. No traces. Nothing but a blanket in the bushes. Chica stood up suddenly, swaying on her feet. My son. My only son. The revelation crashed over her like a wave. Do you know what the doctors told me after his birth? That I could never have another child. A Hannah was my miracle, my only chance at motherhood. Her voice broke. And that woman, that monster, as if summoned by her words, they heard the commotion outside. Through the hospital window, they could see Afir being led to a police van, protesters gathering around her. The media had gotten hold of the story, and public outrage was at its peak. She's going to prison, Elle said. For life. They watched as Afir was wheeled into the van, her legs useless beneath her hospital gown. The same legs that had once carried her proudly through her house, while she forced a disabled child to crawl on bleeding knees. Perfect justice, Chica said, her voice hard as stone. She took my son's ability to walk, and now she'll never walk again. But justice felt hollow in the face of such loss. In the days that followed, Chica learned more about her son's suffering. How he had tried to please Afir, how he had cleaned and worked despite his disability, how he had maintained hope even in the darkest moments. Each new detail was another knife in her heart. She thought of her boy, crawling through that house, believing his mother was dead while she was actually alive, but lost in madness. She thought of him shivering in the rain on his birthday, of him lying unconscious in the forest. The local media couldn't get enough of the story. Headlines screamed about the cruel aunt, the disabled boy, the missing child. Reporters camped outside the courthouse during Afir's trial, their cameras flashing like lightning as she was wheeled in and out. The courtroom fell silent when Chica testified. She spoke of Hannah's birth, of the accident that took his father's life and his ability to walk, of her desperate visit to the witch doctor that had cost her years of her life. As she spoke, even the judge wiped away tears. When the sentence was pronounced, life imprisonment, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the courtroom. Justice had been served, they said. The cruel woman would pay for her crimes. But for Chica, no punishment could ever be enough. Prison bars couldn't bring back her son. Afir's paralysis couldn't undo the years of torture Hannah had endured. The truth was a weight that threatened to crush her. She had been alive all this time, trapped in madness while her son suffered and disappeared. At night, she would wake up screaming, reaching for a child who wasn't there. The three revelations haunted her dreams. Her family mourning her false death, her son's torture and disappearance, and the cruel twist of fate that had kept her alive but unable to protect her only child. In her darkest moments, she wondered if it would have been better to remain lost in madness, rather than wake to such unbearable truth. But deep in her heart, a mother's instinct whispered that somewhere, somehow, her son might still be alive. It was a hope she couldn't bear to have, yet couldn't bear to lose. Sleep never came easily to Chica anymore. Each night, she would lie awake, staring at her ceiling, imagining her son's voice calling out to her in the darkness. The voice that had broken through her madness now haunted her dreams, a constant reminder of what she had lost. You need to rest, Allah would tell her, watching his sister grow thinner, more hollow-eyed with each passing day. You need to take care of yourself. But how could she rest? How could she sleep in a warm bed when she didn't know if her son had died cold and alone in that forest? The thought would grip her heart like an iron fist, squeezing until she couldn't breathe. Allah, desperate to help his sister heal, began introducing her to suitable men. Each one came with kind eyes and gentle words, bearing gifts and good intentions. But Chica saw through them all, saw the pity in their eyes, heard the hesitation in their voices when they learned her story. Among them was Elle, a quiet man with steady hands and a patient smile. He would bring her flowers, tell her stories of his travels, try to make her laugh. But Chica's laughter had died the day she learned of her son's fate. You can't live like this forever, Elle said one evening, after another silent dinner where Chica had barely touched her food. Others have faced loss too, and yet they found the strength to keep living. His words, meant to comfort, struck like matches against dry wood. Chica's eyes flashed with sudden fire. Others, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Others haven't watched their child crawl on bleeding knees. Others haven't learned that while they were lost in darkness, their only son was being tortured. Others haven't had to imagine their 10-year-old boy abandoned in a forest, alone and afraid. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. You speak of loss as if it's something that can be measured, compared, set aside like an old photograph. My son, her voice broke. My Ahana was made to clean floors until his hands bled. He was forced to sleep on cold ground, denied even the basic dignity of his crutches. Em reached out to her, but she stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. No one understands, she continued, tears streaming down her face. When you close your eyes at night, do you see your child shivering in the rain? Do you wake up wondering if he called for you in his final moments? Do you carry the weight of knowing you were alive, but not there when he needed you most? The silence that followed was deafening. Allo stood in the doorway, watching his sister's pain pour out like a river breaking through a dam. Everyone wants me to move on, Chica said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But how can I? When I close my eyes, I see him. When I open them, I look for him. Every child's laugh makes me turn, hoping. Every night, I wonder, is he cold? Is he hungry? Is he? She couldn't finish the thought. I'm left that night, understanding finally that there are some wounds too deep for comfort, some losses too profound for healing. As his footsteps faded away, Chica turned to her brother. They think time should make it easier, she said softly. But each day without knowing is another day of torture. Each morning I wake up, and for a moment, just a moment, I forget. And then it all comes rushing back, and I have to lose him all over again. Allo watched as his sister retreated to her room, closing the door on the world that wanted her to heal, to move on, to forget. But how could she? A mother's heart doesn't forget. It doesn't move on. It beats with the same rhythm, the same love, the same pain, until it finds what it has lost. In the quiet of her room, Chica would often hold the last photograph she had of Ahana, taken before the accident that took his ability to walk. In it, he smiled with such innocence, such trust in the world. She would trace his face with trembling fingers, remembering how his hair felt under her hands, how his laughter used to fill their home. Where are you, my son? She would whisper to the photograph. Are you watching over me? Or are you somewhere out there, needing me still? The questions echoed in her empty room, unanswered but unceasing, like her love, like her pain, like her hope that refused to die even when hope seemed foolish. Because a mother's heart knows no calendar, no clock, no measure of time that can make it stop searching for its child. Prison walls cast long shadows over Afir's new life. Dawn wore her fine clothes in proud stance, replaced by a gray uniform and a wheelchair she couldn't escape. The woman who once made a disabled child crawl now knew the bitter taste of helplessness. Her fellow inmates had heard her story. In prison, news travels fast, and cruelty to children earns no friends. Look who's crawling now, they would sneer as she struggled to move across her cell floor. They made sure her bed was always wet, her food always cold, her nights always sleepless. The guards looked away, pretending not to notice. After all, hadn't she done worse to a helpless child? When word came that she had a visitor, Afir willed herself to the visiting room with trembling hands. Through the scratched glass partition, she saw Chica sitting straight-backed and stern, eyes burning with the intensity of years of loss. Why? Chica's first word cut through the air like a blade. Why did you torture my son? Afir's lips trembled. I'm sorry, she whispered, but Chica raised her hand, silencing her. I'm not here for your apologies, she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her eyes. I want you to know what you destroyed. Who you destroyed. She placed a photograph on the counter between them. It showed a young Ahana standing proudly before the accident that changed everything. He wasn't born disabled, Chica continued, watching Afir's face. He was the strongest, most active child you could imagine. Then one day, his father took him for a walk. A careless driver changed everything in seconds. His father died instantly. Hannah survived, but spent 6 months in a coma. Afir's hands clutched at her useless legs, her face draining of color. When he woke up, Chica's voice cracked slightly. The doctor said he would never walk normally again. But do you know what he did? He smiled. He thanked them for saving his life. That was the kind of child he was. The kind of child you broke. Tears rolled down Afir's cheeks now, but Chica wasn't finished. After I gave birth to him, there were complications. The doctors told me I could never have another child. Hannah was my miracle, my only chance at motherhood. And you, her voice hardened. You called him Cockroach. You made him crawl until his knees bled. You threw him out in the rain on his birthday. The other visitors and inmates had fallen silent, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Even the guard stood still, listening. Now look at you, Chica continued, gesturing to Afir's wheelchair. Karma has a perfect sense of justice, doesn't it? You who took away my son's ability to walk, now you'll never walk again. You who made him crawl, now you crawl. You who showed no mercy, now live at the mercy of others. Afir bent forward, sobbing. I didn't know. I didn't understand. No, you didn't want to understand, Chica corrected her. You saw a child who needed help, and you chose cruelty. You saw innocence, and you chose to destroy it. She stood up, gathering her strength for her final words. I hope every time you struggle to move, every time you need help with the simplest tasks, you remember my son. I hope when you lie awake at night, you hear his voice, just as I do. I hope your dreams are haunted by the image of him crawling through your house, just as mine are. As Chica turned to leave, Afir called out desperately, Will you ever forgive me? Chica paused at the door. That's not for me to give. The only person who could forgive you is the boy you left in the forest. And we don't know if he's alive to give it. That night, in her cold cell, Afir learned what true isolation feels like. Her fellow inmates had heard every word of Chica's story, and their treatment of her grew even harsher. They made her crawl for her food, just as she had made Hannah crawl. They called her Cockroach, turning her own cruel words back on her. In the darkness, she finally understood the full weight of what she had done, not just to a disabled child, but to a mother's only miracle, to a boy who had already lost so much. As she lay there, unable to sleep, unable to walk, unable to escape her guilt, she heard what seemed like a child's laughter echoing through the prison corridors. Whether it was real or just her conscience finally speaking, she would never know. But she knew this. Justice had found her, and it wore the face of her own cruelty. Time had not been kind to Chica's heart. Years of grief had worn it down, like water slowly eroding stone, until one morning she collapsed in her brother's arms. The local doctors' faces were grim as they delivered their verdict. She needed specialized surgery, and only one surgeon in the state could perform it. He's the best, they assured Elle, who held his sister's hand in the hospital room. If anyone can save her, it's him. The surgeon was away, they explained, but would return that evening. Each hour of waiting felt like a lifetime. Elle paced the hospital corridors, remembering how he had lost his sister once before to madness, praying he wouldn't lose her again to death. The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of Elle sitting in the waiting room, clutching a cup of cold coffee, watching the clock's hands move with agonizing slowness. When a doctor finally emerged to say the surgery was successful, Elle wept with relief. Morning came, and with it, hope. Chica was awake, her eyes clear, her voice weak but steady. The nurses told them the surgeon would visit soon for a post-operation check. When Elle left briefly to freshen up at his hotel, he had no idea that destiny was about to complete its circle. Returning to the hospital, Elle found his sister in tears. But these were different tears from the ones he had grown accustomed to seeing. These tears streamed down her smiling face as she spoke with the tall, distinguished-looking doctor. Thank you for looking after my mother, uncle, the surgeon said, turning to face Elle. The world stopped spinning. There, in a white coat, wearing a stethoscope around his neck, stood Hannah. No longer the crawling child, but a man. A doctor. A surgeon who had just saved his own mother's life. Allah's legs gave way. He grabbed the doorframe for support, his voice barely a whisper. Hannah, you can walk? The story spilled out then, like water from a broken dam. Of how a wealthy man named Mr. Okoye had found a Hannah in the forest that night, barely alive. Of how this man, who had lost his own family to tragedy, saw in a Hannah a chance at redemption. He gave me everything, Hannah explained, his voice soft with gratitude. The best medical care, education, love. He became the father I never had. Chika reached for her son's hand, still unable to believe he was real, unable to stop touching him to make sure he wouldn't disappear again. When I became strong enough, Hannah continued, I decided to become a doctor. I wanted to heal hearts, not just the physical ones, but the broken ones too, like mine was, like yours were. His mother's tears fell faster now. All these years, she whispered, all these years I dreamed of finding you. And here you are, saving my life. Hannah smiled. The same gentle smile he had worn as a child, even in his darkest moments. Maybe that's why I became a heart surgeon, Mother. So I could fix your broken heart. The hospital room, once filled with pain and fear, now overflowed with joy and wonder. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light through the window. It fell across Hannah's face, highlighting the features that had changed, and those that remained the same. The kind eyes, the gentle smile, the unbreakable spirit that had carried him from crawling in darkness to standing in light. My son, Chika said, touching his face as if memorizing it anew. My miracle, twice given back to me. For in this moment, all the years of separation, all the pain and loss, transformed into something beautiful. The boy who had been forced to crawl had risen not just to walk, but to soar. The child they thought lost in darkness had become a light of healing for others. And in that hospital room, 3 hearts beat as one, whole, healed, and finally, irrevocably, home. The prison visiting room felt smaller than usual that morning. Fear wheeled herself in, her movements clumsy after years of confinement. She didn't recognize the well-dressed man waiting on the other side of the glass. His suit was perfectly tailored, his presence commanding. Only his eyes seemed familiar somehow, holding memories she couldn't quite grasp. Who are you? She asked, her voice rough from disuse. Few people visited her anymore. The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. I'm Hannah, he said quietly. The boy you left in the forest. The words hit her like physical blows. Her hands gripped her wheelchair's arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. The successful surgeon before her bore little resemblance to the crawling child she had tormented. Yet in his eyes, she saw the same spirit she had tried so hard to break. You, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're alive. And you can walk? Yes, Anti-Fear, he replied, the old title carrying the weight of years. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Just as you never imagined being confined to a wheelchair, I never imagined becoming a surgeon. Tears began rolling down Afir's cheeks. The boy I tortured now stands before me as a doctor, a heart surgeon, Hannah corrected gently. I just performed successful surgery on my mother, the woman you told me was dead. Another surprise life had in store. Afir's body began to shake with sobs. All her cruelty, all her attempts to destroy this child, had failed. Instead of breaking him, she had unknowingly set him on a path to greatness. I don't deserve forgiveness, she whispered. Perhaps not, Hannah agreed. But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to break the cycle of pain. He paused, studying the woman who had once towered over him with such cruelty. Do you remember what you used to call me? A cockroach, she answered, shame coloring her voice. Yes. You said I was nothing but a crawling thing. His voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. Now look at us both. You're the one who can't walk, while I stand here as a respected surgeon. But I didn't come to gloat, Anti-Fear. I came to free us both. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Himself as a child, sitting in a wheelchair after the accident that first took his ability to walk. This was me before I came to live with you, he explained. A boy who had lost his father, who thought he had lost his mother, who needed nothing more than kindness. You chose cruelty instead, but your cruelty didn't define me. The love of others, my mother's memory, Uncle Alo's care, and later, Mr. Okoye's kindness. That's what shaped me. Fear couldn't look away from the photograph, from the smiling child she had worked so hard to destroy. I forgive you, Hannah said simply, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry the weight of your cruelty any longer. Your punishment isn't your paralysis or your imprisonment. It's having to live with the knowledge that the child you tried to break has risen far beyond your power to harm him. He stood then, his full height emphasized by her seated position. I hope you find peace, Auntie Afir. I hope you learn that true strength isn't in the power to make others crawl, but in the courage to help them stand. As he turned to leave, Afir called out, her voice breaking, "Wait, please. How did you survive that night?" Hannah paused at the door. "A good man found me. He showed me that for every person who chooses cruelty, there's another who chooses kindness. He taught me that our lives are shaped not by what happens to us, but by how we choose to rise above it." With those words, he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the prison corridor. Behind him, Afir wept, not just for what she had done, but for what she had failed to see, the indomitable spirit of a child who refused to be broken. That evening, Ahana returned home to where his mother waited. Chika opened her arms, and her son, no longer the crawling child, but a man who had conquered his past, stepped into her embrace. They held each other, feeling the rhythm of their hearts beating in sync, hearts that had endured separation, hearts that had found their way back to each other. And somewhere in the night, the last echoes of old pain faded away, replaced by the steady pulse of love that had survived it all. A love that had transformed a crawling boy into a healing man. A love that had turned tragedy into triumph. A love that had proven stronger than any cruelty the world could devise.